Well, I wish I had a needle and thread, the finest I could sew. I'd sew my Cindy to my side, and down the road I'd go. What is up, boys? We are back with another Seeing Through Gebser. This is a very, very important video because we have finally arrived at the philosophy section. Now, I'm assuming that most of you guys are philosophy students, even though Gebser, I guess if you want to strictly categorize him, he would be a psychologist, but he's also a philosopher too. So hopefully this will be something interesting for you guys, as the rest of the book is. Let me know, by the way. I think he makes a couple mistakes. We're going to get into it. We're going to get into it in this video. He makes a critique of Heidegger that, at first when I read it, I was like, yeah, that seems pretty good. And now that I've thought about it, I think, no, actually, that doesn't make much sense. Once again, I don't mean to disappoint. This is not a history of philosophy. That's not what this is. Remember, we're just doing the 3 points or the however many points. We're talking about time. We're talking about how time affects the systems and irrationality. We're not doing some deep dive history of philosophy, but it should be interesting. This will probably be the shorter video of the two in this section. There will be at least two, probably two. Surprisingly enough, Gebser spends more time on language and grammar, the English, not just English like books, but actual syntax, than he does any of these other. It's quite fascinating. But this section actually isn't the longest. We're not going to finish it today, though. So let's see. I say without further ado, let's get into it, right? Now, we are going to be getting a little abstract in this video today. Once we get to Heidegger, which won't be very long, we're going to be a little lost. Also, this is very important, since assuming most of you guys are philosophers, correct me. I'd prefer if you're cool about it, but you don't have to be. This is the internet, after all. Correct me if I get something wrong. If I have a misunderstanding of Heidegger or whoever, correct me. I don't care about it's not important to me to be seen as like the smartest philosopher in the world. So if you just offer something better, I will adopt it. So this should be fun. Let's get into it. I'm probably not going to do a ton of, in the other sections, we read probably about 85% of what Gebser writes. Some of these other paragraphs, they're nice and they belong in the book, but they compound knowledge we've already covered, or they're referencing things that are just so esoteric to the point where I don't even know if anyone knows what the hell he's talking about. But today, I think we're just going to read them right through for the most part. Okay. Our view that the perspectival rational age is coming to a close is also reinforced by philosophy in such a way as to leave nothing to be desired in the way of clarity. In Martin Heidegger's book, Holzweg, Holzwege, there is a chapter written in 1946 entitled, quote, "The Saying of Anaximander." This saying deals with the presumably earliest expression of Western thought, and because we in the West feel such an affinity for what is contained in this philosophy, Heidegger describes this as, quote, "the latest late arrivals of philosophy," unquote. Philosophy, which began with the Greek thinkers at the moment of mutation from the mythical to the mental consciousness, is coming to a close. That's another thing. I should warn you, Gebser, he thinks philosophy is dying. He thinks it's superseding itself and turning into etiology, which he calls something else. Because philosophy is product of the mental structure, which means it's confined to space. All your little philosophical systems, the reason why they all fail is because they are confined to space, and they're confined even further to the limitations of rationality. Great. I'll let you decide if you think Gebser thinks this end is a good thing or a bad thing. He thinks it's a good thing, don't get me wrong, because he thinks this is a necessary transition to integral consciousness. Okay, that's fine. But there does seem to be a little reveling in, I don't know why. I don't know what he has with philosophers, but it's pretty funny. This is indicated by Heidegger's eschatological, so eschatology is a myth or a theory relating to end times, the end of something, usually end of something big, like the world. So eschatological myths, Christianity will, I don't know, I'm not a Christian. The world will burn and everything will gun, and then everything will blow up, and then God will come down, send Jesus, and save us and carry us to heaven if something were like that were to happen. That's an eschatological myth. My goodness, messed up my hair. By Heidegger's eschatological statements that follow the remarks cited above. Quote, "Are we on the brink of the most enormous transformation of the entire earth and of the time of historical space wherein it is suspended? Are we on the eve of a night leading toward a new dawn?" Seems to me that Heidegger is picking up not only that we're in an age of transition into integral consciousness, he might not describe it that way, but also he says time. There's a point. Time is a factor here. It's a world constituent. It's finally being recognized. Are we about to depart on the trek into the ambiguities? Are we about to depart on the trek into the historical landscape of Earth's evening? Is this land of evening just now coming into being? Are we today occidental in the sense that the night of the world comes on only via our transition? What do we care for all the historically calculated philosophies of history that dazzle us with the superficialities of the historically assembled material, attempting to explain history without ever considering the basis of their explanations from their essence of history, and this from being itself? Are we the latecomers, or are we at the same time the early arrivals of the early arrivals of the dawn of an entirely new age, which has already left behind our present conceptions of history? So this is a pretty indirect, like I said, just sort of illumination of where we are in terms of philosophy. We're either super late insofar as we haven't really advanced too much on the Greeks, or we're in a transition. And I think Heidegger, of course, and this also speaks, I think, to Heidegger's psychology going into what he does, and maybe even why he explains things as he does. He's trying to get into a deeper level of analysis of thought, of whatever, of philosophical whatever, than, as he calls it, the superficialities of the historically assembled material and their historically calculated philosophies. There's another quote that Gebser makes of Heidegger when he says, thought is essentially the strongest impediment to thinking or being or understanding or something like that. It's pretty based. There is a certain irony in the fact, this is Gebser now, there is a certain irony in the fact that Heidegger, in his secularized theology without God, is led to eschatological attitudes, whereas Alois Dempf, excuse me if I'm mispronouncing, has given us a, quote, self-critique of philosophy, unquote, with which he reduces the anthropological existential point of view to a reasonable dimension via a grand survey of philosophy. The weighty objections that can be mounted against all existential efforts, be they the existence illumination of Jaspers, the existential analytic fundamental ontology of Heidegger, or the psychoanalysis-infected existentialism of Sartre, must not deter us from an appraisal of existentialism. Aside from the spiritual impoverishment and the anthropocentric reductionism evident from the treatment of human existence by prominent thinkers today as their exclusive concern, there is also a certain ambiguity best illustrated by Heidegger, an ambiguity even conceded to Heidegger by one of his best friends. So he's saying there are weighty objections to existentialism. He doesn't really get into them. I wish he would. But it should be appraised as well. And also, man, existentialists, don't come to me and reduce man down to its most base, primitive, all this nausea, all this Sartre nihilism, and all this crap, and then come whining to me when you have a bunch of irrational poets being like, yeah, I'm not accepting this, and if I have to expend my energy in your domains, I'm going to do it. If we're going to have existentialism, at least can we have some good existentialists, and not just these depressing, where everything is just isolation and detachment, and to a certain extent it's applicable because we live in the age of rationalism deficient. Okay, sure, but man, they just take it way too far. I'm just not. The problem with existentialism, invariably, in my opinion, is that you learn less about the world and you learn more about the psyche of the existentialist you're reading. That's really what it comes down to, in my opinion. Now, I am opening to have my mind changed on that, but I don't know. I just don't see too much value in it, or at the very least in the way I've seen it propounded and sort of acted out, if you will. I just see a bunch of neurotic over paralysis by analysis, and if you ever come down and unfreeze yourself from this trap you've set yourself up in, it always ends up in an unfavorable conclusion where we're all just these nauseated whatever, just monkeys, apes doing nothing. We can never know everything, so I'm tired of it. By this very ambivalence, Heidegger's thought demonstrates the Janus face aspect of our epoch. So remember, the Janus face means you have two faces facing different directions simultaneously. So if you see the coin, and you just look up Janus face coin, you'll see two separate faces looking in... Actually, I shouldn't say that. Two of the same face, almost, looking in separate directions. That's what Janus face means. It's almost that polar complementarity aspect. Demonstrates the Janus-faced aspect of our epoch, most acutely manifest in the German world. The Anglo-Saxon regions, by contrast, have largely ignored the European anxiety about existence, which underlies all existentialism. Remember, philosophers, former rationalists, when you go back into your class, remind your fellow students that they are not these floating, formless, essenceless, neutral things just kind of hanging out in this sort of, I'm just hanging out. I'm in this neutral phase space. It's invisible, apparently. And I don't know what I am. I'm not a human being on Earth with a particular constitution and particular nature and particular psychological biases and all that stuff. No, I'm just this perfect, flawless, objective thing just kind of analyzing the world. No. My point I'm trying to make is existentialism as a philosophy or a school of philosophy did not come about completely divorced from influence of the psyche. It came about because of the psyche, and it in turn affects the psyche in turn. So remind them that existentialism really originates with an anxiety about human existence. I don't know if this anxiety needs to exist, quite frankly, especially once you take the spiritual principle seriously. I don't really understand why it needs to exist. This is why I don't like existentialism, because I don't really have an anxiety about my existence. I mean, maybe that's surface level or delusional, but I don't think it is, quite frankly. I mean, I'm spiritually protected. Even if I didn't believe that and I went back to being atheist, okay, you die and you just return to the state of nothing that was. Like, okay. I mean, yeah, it's, I guess, not great, but good thing there's a spiritual principle out there, and even then, it's not going to cause me anxiety. Who cares? Anyways, let's get back to it. Anxiety about existence, which underlies all existentialism. Yet even there, as Heinrich Strawman has recently demonstrated, existential seeds can be seen germinating particularly in the pragmatism formulated at the turn of the century by William James and John Dewey. We have a very different situation with the phenomenology founded by Husserl. To the extent that it is known at all outside the German-speaking world, it is mostly rejected, as for example by Guido de Ruggiero. Phenomenology is preeminently a qualitative theory of essence and, as Hedwig Conrad Martius emphasizes, forms a counterpole particularly to radical existentialism. As its earliest interpreter, Adolf Reinach, points out, it is concerned, quote, not with existence, but with essence, with all possible modes of consciousness as such, irrespective of where, if, and when they occur, unquote. We will have more to say about phenomenology later in our discussion. So I am going to warn you, I might bastardize phenomenology, but this is how I understand what phenomenology is. So it is a way of, I guess, perceiving an object. And the natural attitude, if you want to call it that, and I believe in Husserl's language, the natural attitude is to posit that something is real or to recognize something as real. And then all these value judgments are imparted to that object. So I'm walking through the street, I see my ex-girlfriend, she's a real person, real thing in the world affecting me, and that's bad because I don't know, I left on bad terms with her. Or you could do the other way. I'm walking through, she's a real thing, and it's good. I miss her. She was a good person. Yeah, I don't want to get back together, but she's a good person. Great. So that's the natural attitude, right? That's probably how you and I have been living our entire lives. So I think, and I could be wrong, what Husserl was trying to do was say, why don't we bracket the treating it as real and the natural attitude and engage in this sort of, I don't want to call it intuitive gazing, but step into the waters of being in essence rather than imposing mental prejudices onto it, letting being in all of its variance and plentitude reveal itself to you rather than you confirming that it's real, and then imparting all these value objects. That's I believe that's what an understanding of phenomena. I'm sure it's a little more complex than that. And I think that's what he's referencing when he calls it. I think it's called epoche. Again, philosophers, I apologize if I bastardize. I don't mean to. It's not meant to offend. Okay, now we're going to get into Heidegger. We're going to get into it, baby. In Being and Time, Heidegger has exhausted and driven to its limits the assertions of speculative private philosophy and, by hyperformulation and hyperdifferentiation, has placed its very value into question. So what Gebser is saying here is that rationalism has been made clear through Heidegger's, not necessarily what he's saying, but the methodology by which he is using it. And that's why I think earlier, when he had that little shot against Heidegger where he said he rationalizes all meaning away until there's nothing. I think that's what he's referencing. It's like this hyper differentiation where it almost reminds me of that Leibniz thing where if you have two things that are literally exactly the same in all respects, you don't have two things. Well, Heidegger's like, I'll find that new thing. You know what I mean? Like there is a differentiation. So I'll save my thoughts. Heidegger no longer basks in the light of previous philosophies, but stands in the twilight of transition. The question as to the, quote, meaning of being, unquote, and the previous reply that it is a, quote, being toward death, unquote, a psychic mood transposed into an ontic position, has been succeeded by a new ambiguity. So when Heidegger, I believe, that's what he was referencing, I'd imagine, he says that being, what being really is, I guess Dasein, is a being towards death. Gebser says, motherfucker, that does not come out. That does not, like I said earlier, that is not separate from your psyche. That is you taking a psychic state or whatever and imposing it onto ontology. This is a distortion. Nonsense. I would argue any being to the level that Heidegger's talking about that doesn't invoke some sort of spirituality is nonsense. But that's just my opinion. New ambiguity. Oh, I'm going to mess up this word. The circuitous route to this ambiguity led through the mythical realm, which is tantamount to an implicit recognition of the psyche. Quote, the paths through the woods. Holzwege. Okay, we're going to talk about this for a second. So Holzweg, or Vega, however you pronounce it, I believe it's just a work from Martin Heidegger in which he did some sort of philosophical, or maybe in Gebser's term, etiological investigations on certain subjects, but the difference is a Holzweg, or Holzwege, is a path in the woods that does have a purpose, but often ends abruptly and sort of pitters out, if that makes sense. It doesn't lead you outside of the forest. It's not the clear, straight path that the rationalists like that leads you out of the forest. It takes you through the forest in different ways, and then it sort of abruptly ends. And that's kind of what Heidegger is doing in his Holzweg. I apologize. So rather than offering the 3D mental structure, here's the clear, rational, limited to the quantifiably measurable and consciously known, everything's clear, everything's accounted for, everything's has been illuminated, Heidegger says no. Heidegger says, I'm going to take a different route. It's not going to offer the same rational clarity that the traditional rationalists would make. This is a key point. It's not going to offer that same clarity, and we know that because it ends abruptly and often dissatisfyingly. And in doing so, in taking the sort of different Holzweg, the different paths, what I'm really doing is illuminating an aspect of being that the rationalists were not able to see because they took the straight path. So rather than offering clear-cut, yes or no, either or definitive answers or, answers to questions, Heidegger says no. Let's take the path, take the journey, and simply illuminate this aspect of being, this aspect of the world, this aspect of the way of doing things, and let it stand on its own, rather than trying to distort it by employing a rational judgment. That is one way you can perceive it, and that's Heidegger's whole point. Let me illuminate this other way, this irrational way. What Heidegger's doing, which you think someone like Jean Gebser would be able to recognize, is rather than... Here's what's happening. Heidegger is refraining from positing, as I said, clear-cut, rational judgments that are nice and neat, and everything is accounted for, and everything's causal and mechanical and all that. He's refraining from doing that in the attempt to illuminate this aspect of being and all that stuff. Awesome. Gebser has made the mistake in assuming that because Heidegger is not offering a clear-cut, measurable, rational, definitive answer, he must necessarily be regressing into the paths through the woods, or the Holzweg, which Gebser associates with the psyche, which is to say with the mythical structure and the 2D flat circle. Now, of course, it's almost not even worth saying, but I'm going to say it anyways. Obviously, 2D flat circle, 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 2D flat the pre-rational and the irrational, particularly the irrational, is also not going to offer you the clear-cut, rational, definitive answers that are in alignment with the rational way of relating objects in the world to each other, because that's irrationality. Also true is that irrationality, by inherent in its concept or definition, being without rationality, it will offer answers that are not rationally clear-cut, meticulous, and all that stuff. So why in the world would you necessarily assume that Heidegger is regressing into the psyche when he's actively acknowledging the restraints of reason and rationality and refusing to employ it so as not to distort the truth? This is Gebser's entire point. When you employ rationality, which is built on space, which is limited to space and imposes spatial limitations in an area where it doesn't belong, you don't attain truth, you distort the truth. Is that not exactly what Martin Heidegger is doing right now? That's exactly what he's doing with his paths through the woods. Yes, they do not offer the clear path out of the woods, but they illuminate an aspect of the woods that would not have been illuminated with your mental way of doing things. It is unbelievable to me that Gebser does this. It is insane. When Heidegger is refusing to distort the truth through rational imposition, it's not a regression to the mythical structure. It's not a regression to irrationality. It's ontological restraint in favor of irrationality, which opens a broader and deeper and more inclusive region of truth. So, again, here's like the mind-blowing thing. You would think Jean Gebser would be I don't use this word lightly, like literally most perfect recipient for this argument. Who could you possibly want to explain? Who would you rather explain that to, a rationalist or Jean Gebser? You're obviously going to choose the latter because Jean Gebser is as irrational as they come. So why in the world are you holding Heidegger to rationalist standards when you are trying to overcome and surpass and transcend rationality, transcend rationalism, and yet you are imposing rationalism onto Heidegger as a criteria and claiming that he's the one who failed? No, you failed, Jean Gebser, because you, in my opinion, have some beef with Heidegger. I don't know what it is. I don't know if he banged your girlfriend. I don't know if you just don't like reading him because he's super obscure. I don't know what it is. But the fact that he lets this go on Heidegger, it's like Mark Rothko coming up to you. You going up to Mark Rothko and be like, look at my abstract expressionist painting, pretty cool, right? He'd be like, I don't understand. Can the tree actually be, like, I can't even tell it's a tree. Can it be perspectively correct? Like, what? Why are you telling me this? Let me know, philosophers, what you guys think of that. We're going to expand on this, but that's just insane to me. That's just insane to me that he would make that critique. I understand you want to transcend and include, but sometimes you don't include because for the reasons we've already discussed. Okay. I don't know. I just didn't think I would have to explain to Jean Gebser the problems of rationalism. You know what I mean? It's very odd. Now, I'm going to give a little bit of credit to Gebser after. Here's where Gebser's critique kind of lands. He is right that the psyche is present. He is right about that because, as Gebser's amazing insight, one of his amazing insights is that the pre-rational, irrational, and rational are simultaneously present and efficacious. So, to an extent, yes, it is trivially true. It's like a truism that, yes, the psyche is present here. But again, Jean, if Heidegger is being too mythical, right, and acting in a way in the mythical consciousness structure exclusively, right, and doing the same mistake that the mental structure does, you would be able to attain that not by just looking at the poetic language used to describe Heidegger's works. That's incredibly surface level. Is he being polar complementarity? Is he negating rationality? Is he negating deficiently all the mental biases and all that stuff? Is he doing this symbolic resonance? Like, why you would necessarily say that's the psyche and exclusively the psyche, it's just beyond me. I don't know. I think that's a ridiculous criticism for Gebser. I think he's got some personal beef with Heidegger, which should be a lesson to you all that just because you're into this stuff, that doesn't mean you're flawless. I'm not flawless. I have biases too. I try to be honest about them, but you know, we're none of us are perfect. So don't be a sycophant for Gebser. As much as I love the guy, I absolutely do, but. You know, he's not a god. He's not flawless. What he says does not necessarily become law just because he said it. I think this is a ridiculous critique. I think it's absolutely ridiculous. But let's expand on it. In a patently ambiguous manner, Heidegger's Holzweg, I'm going to pronounce it that way, I apologize, does, however, contain an uncompelling and distorted inception of an irrational nature. Here we go. These paths through the woods exhibit neither the lack of relationships nor the extreme existential isolation of contemporary man, although according to Grimm's dictionary, a wood path is a path into the, quote, woods for practical and economic reasons, not for connecting two places. So this is what he's saying now is less of like a philosophical ontological critique. Now he's saying your existentialism doesn't match anthropologically man right now. So this is, I think, a more defendable argument. The pragmatic emphasis in this definition is as significant as the human unrelatedness, which is further underscored by the suggested, quote, contrast between the wood path and the straight and correct street, unquote. It is symptomatic that although the straight and directed has formed the bases of Western thought since at least 500 BC, Heidegger recognizes them as being inadequate. It is only regrettable that while rejecting the mental rational, Heidegger regresses to the irrational and is only able to intimate the illumination of the irrational via occasional opalescent luminescences. Again, the positing of a rationally unclear and rationally dissatisfying statement or claim or whatever does not necessarily mean a regression. I can't believe I have to explain this to Mr. Irrational Integral, but okay. Maybe I'm crazy. Maybe I'm missing it. I do worry. My confidence is high, so I'm a little worried that maybe I'm just not getting it. And that has less to do with me, just how intelligent Gebser is. But hey, intelligent people can be wrong. The basic change in philosophy that aims at its own supersession is not only evident in Heidegger. If we pursue the general trend of contemporary philosophical schools, it is apparent that spatially limited, conceptually bound thinking of a rational character is beginning to give way to new modes of realization that are truly aperspectival in nature. The inceptual supersession of the three-dimensional mental, the inceptual supersession of the three-dimensional mentality in philosophy, and therefore its own supersession, is manifest in 1. The incorporation of time as a proper element in philosophical thought. Just remind yourself of rule number 1 of all those other subjects. Number 2, the admission of the inadequacy of rationality. So normally it's dualism, but this goes even further than that. This is just where rationality is gone. 3, the turn toward the whole and turn toward diaphaneity. So it's interesting. He really doesn't consider a rational philosophy to be philosophy. He considers it something else entirely. He considers it etiology, which is interesting, if nothing else. As regards 1, the problem of time has been moving into the philosophical forefront since the turn from the 18th to the 19th century. We have repeatedly remarked on the general falsification of time and the neglect of the time question, also in connection with the work of Werner Gent. Georges Poulet, has subsequently made an important contribution to this subject in his Études sur les temps humains. In his foreword, he especially emphasizes that the time question, in our sense, did not yet pose a problem for the Christian Middle Ages. It was most likely Pascal who paved the way for the eruption of time, which came about indirectly and is visible today only after it has become clear what of time's immanent essence was obscured by the false employment of concept of time. At the very moment when Descartes introduces his analytic method, a method which is invariably quantitative, Pascal is drafting his philosophy of the heart, preeminently valuative and qualitative in character. So there's, Gebser associates this with time. It's interesting to think of why. I think I could make an argument, but I would like him to be a little more clear. But notice what's happening here. We have Descartes, and to be clear, Gebser identifies Descartes as the limit. Descartes and his XYZ Cartesian phase space, the Cartesian coordinates, pretty much all of that is rationalism in the sense of you're transforming quality into quantity. And if you stick with that exclusive, you're going to have a problem. So Descartes really is rationalism kind of personified and the beginning of it. Now, another problem, you can kind of tell why he thinks that, right? This idea of the ghost in the machine. And I do admit, maybe I don't have an understanding of this concept, but I don't like the dualism in this. I do not like the dualism. The idea that the ghost and the machine are separate and one commands the other is, I think, ridiculous. Remember, it's an integral phenomenon. They're both part of a whole, a complementary whole that's constantly creating and conditioning each other. So, no, we can drop that. And then we have another example of rationalism, of you being hyper-skeptical and engaging in extreme skepticism to the point where, what is the cogito ergo sum? Look, we can't be skeptical of everything, especially if we ignore our pre-rational and irrational elements. This is what the postmodernists did. This is why the rationalists failed to defeat the postmodernists, because when the postmodernists said, hey, there's a meta-narrative acting as the foundation of all your knowledge structures, what they're really touching on is the mythical structure. Instead of saying, no, our systems are purely rational, just like us, and we don't have no contact with the irrational myths, and instead of saying that, be like, yeah, of course it is. We have a multifarious constitution in terms of our collective unconscious. The mythical structures are present in this exact moment, same as the magical. So, of course, the foundation, if you want to call it that, is going to be partly mythical. That's what we are. We're humans, of course. So is yours. The idea that there is no myth, that there is no story, that's a story. That's not a rational claim. There you go. But no, we didn't do that because we had this nonsense of it has to be purely rational. It has to be Descartes. It has to be the spatial XYZ Cartesian, okay? You made a mistake. And now look at us. Let us ask then, in Romano Guardini's words, quote, what is the heart in Pascal's sense? We find that it is above all not an expression of emotion in contrast to logic. It is not an expression of emotion in contrast to logic. It is not a feeling in contrast to the intellect. It is not a soul as opposed to spirit. Soeur? C-O-E-U-R, I apologize. Is itself spirit and a mode of spiritual manifestation. The act of the heart is an act giving knowledge. Certain objects to be present only... Certain objects come to be present only by the act of heart. We are face to face here with the basic structure of man. The phenomenon is inseparable from the relationship of essence to value. Value is the preciousness of things. For Pascal, end quote. For Pascal, the heart, quote, is the organ of the value properties of being in all beings. So how about this, rationalist? Why don't we use our mythical heart, the value, qualitative valuations, in conjunction and integration with our quantitative, analytical, spatial concepts? I think that's a good idea. I know, I'm a genius for pointing that out. This interpretation, based on Pascal's text, is significant because it excludes the merely rational as well as the purely irrational. Moreover, Pascal himself emphasizes the notion of nettete, neatness, a concept that contains, quote, the aspect of clarity and purity, unquote. In this connection, Pascal says, quote, there are two kinds of spirits. One is geometric, in Guardini's words, abstract, logical, and the other could be called de finesse. The way of perceiving that befits the first is slow, tenacious, and inflexible. The second has a certain flexibility of thought and is capable of orienting itself toward the various lovable aspects of whatever it loves, unquote. This is Gebser. Although indirectly, this expresses what we have called perspectival, inflexible, thinking, as well as the encompassing clarity and transparency of our reciprocal perception and impartation of truth in a perspectivity. Pretty good, huh? Pascal also introduces there we go. Here's the first real intro. All right. So the other one, that is great. It's more integral. I'm not entirely sure why he associates that with time, but it is integral. Here's where the truly time concepts come into philosophy, according to Gebser, for the first time. Pascal also introduces two definitely time-bound concepts, that of ennui, boredom, and that of divertissement, temporal diversion. Though at first negatively, he grasps the efficacy of the dammed-up and spatialized energy. So I'll be honest, I'm not sure what temporal diversion is, but ennui, we know what that is, baby. That's time as a quality, time as an intensity. Not, 7:31 p.m. right now. Let's say tomorrow it's 7:30, 7:40. I'm really bored because the power's out and I don't have any books and I'm just kind of staring at my hand doing nothing. I'm bored. That's ennui, right? That's a time-bound concept. That's how you feel during a specific moment. Emphasis on the temporal. It is precisely the time aspects that are suggested in these utterly new notions which Guardernini interprets theologically, while Herbert Plugge, Plugge, evaluates them in terms of psychology and anthropology. G. Paulet, on the other hand, does not touch on these important concepts at all. Ennui and divertissement are expressions of man's search for genuine time. As Pascal writes, man should in fact be able to, quote, sit in his room at peace. In other words, to have time. So why would he be able to sit in his room at peace? Because consciously aware of time as a quality, and consciously aware that it's not just time, but space-time, so your feelings of boredom are directly engendered by the misalignment between what you want internally and when you want it, and what is happening externally and when you want it to happen. That's the problem. Work on yourself. You can always change your internal alignment to match the alignment in terms of space and time of the external. It's going to be difficult, I'll give you that, but what would you rather do? Live in misery and boredom and ennui and turn into Arthur Schopenhauer, or live a meaningful life where you can actually reap all the benefits of time as a plentitude, time as an invisible dimensional backdrop that opens up space, allows it to unfold, and informs it through its work. There you go. The conscious quest for time begins notably with Hegel, who, in his Phenomenology of the Spirit, was the first to deliberately treat the subject of work. But work relates to property as time relates to space. Interesting for all you Hegelians there. Let me know what he's talking about. In the wake of Hegel follows the vast analyses of time. Kierkegaard introduces the concept of temporality in his concept of anxiety by relating the individual moment to eternity, thus opening an aspect of time of which Greeks lacked knowledge. Following Kierkegaard is Bergson, there you go, who takes up the analysis of time in his first work, Time and Freedom. Listen to this. This is some base quotes coming up here. And yet time and freedom are incompatible with determinism. Hello, Alex O'Connor. Your determinist nonsense is nonsense. Absolute nonsense. Their conjunction explodes the quote-unquote systems. As to freedom, Jaspers has remarked that according to Kant, quote, reason cannot grasp how freedom is possible. Unquote. Here, following the incorporation of time, begins the definite escape from the hold of three-dimensional habits of thought. In Time and Freedom, Bergson demonstrates that, quote, each debate between the determinists and their adversaries includes a prior blending of duration with extension, succession with contemporaneity, succession with contemporaneity, and quality with quantity, unquote. Consequently, he devotes the first two chapters to the concepts of intensity and duration, which serve as a foundation for the subject of freedom in the third chapter. So time, another example of temporics and time destroying your set static spatial systems. Why? Because everything is in movement. We are not static phenomena. The human being only becomes determinist when you take what's happening, render it static, and apply this causal mechanical thing that's going on. The problem is when you unpause the hockey game and you realize, oh wait, everything's constantly moving, and if everything's constantly moving, that means things in time are being generated, like the internal potencies or faculties of memory, the ability to imagine fictions, and because these things happen in time, and they might not happen in a singular static moment, but that's not how life works. It is these internal faculties that confer upon us the power of free will. Not this static nonsense. That is not how the world works. Nonsense. If you want more of this, I have a Kill Rationalism going over determinism. It's absolute nonsense. Either read Bergson or read Will Durant's section on Bergson in The Story of Philosophy. Excellent, excellent, excellent section. Excellent section. As Will Durant said, you became way too confident in your beakers, which is to say you are a rationalist. The first work of Bergson, as well as his entire oeuvre, has pioneered the illumination of time's essence and remains even today a fundamental influence on the formation of the new thinking for which his chef d'oeuvre, Creative Evolution, has been decisive. In that work, Bergson not only presents the distinction between durée and temps, duration and time, but also elucidates time's creative aspect. Quote, time is invention or it is nothing at all, unquote. So remember, what Gebser's doing here by listing all these thinkers and all their ideas, we're seeing how time is being incorporated into philosophy, just like all the other domains. It is here in philosophy. You would expect it to be in philosophy, I would hope. But with this, time is unfettered from space. It becomes space-free and acquires an independence which cannot be imputed to it merely by logical inference. I'm going to repeat for emphasis because this is based. With this, time is unfettered from space. It becomes space-free and acquires an independence which cannot be imputed to it merely by logical inference. So, unfortunately, time as an dimension, which is as an invisible dimension, evades rational capture, and that is your problem if you want to stick to rationality, not mine. Nevertheless, a certain passing parallelism, if not in fact a dualism, is established between vital and physical forms of time. Bergson's quote-unquote life philosophy is so well known that it needs no exposition here. Abetted by Nietzsche and Dilthey, it went on to influence German vitalistic philosophy, notably that of L. Klages and Hermann Graf Kieserling, both of whom, regrettably, introduced serious misunderstandings. And later, in his confrontation with Hegel, recorded in Being and Time, Heidegger somewhat willfully resolved the time question, the Hegelian conception that time is only a, quote, perceived concept, unquote, and that, quote, the spirit, in accord with its essence, appears by necessity in time, unquote, via his own formulation of, quote, unquote, temporalization, primordial time, and intertemporality, unquote. For Heidegger, quote, the spirit does not descend into time, but exists as an original temporalization of temporality. Got it. Thank you, Heidegger. Very clear. I think I'm starting to see where Gebser is coming from. I will say, Gebser's not entirely wrong. I haven't read a ton of, I've read just a little bit. Even John David Ebert, who's like a huge fan, super knowledgeable of Heidegger, huge fan of Heidegger, thinks he's awesome. Even he is like, yeah, his writing is just unnecessarily obscure to the point where it's like, what are we doing? Why are we bothering with this? I will say, Gebser's real critique that we talked about earlier at the beginning of this video, he's frustrated that Heidegger is not being clear of what he's doing. I think that's what he's frustrated at. He's not being clear. Hey, I'm being mythical right now. Hey, I'm not being mental, or I am being mental. Hey, I'm being irrational right now. That's Gebser's critique right there. Gebser is all about that. Gebser would say, that's mythical, that's magical, that's mental, that's irrational. The problem with Heidegger's is it does very clearly open a door to regressing into deficient irrationality, very clearly. It's a very slippery slope. The problem with Gebser is you kind of become a rationalist and you just mentally categorize and abstract everything. You have your little systems, and you don't really do anything. You're not living it. You're too busy abstracting it. So it's interesting. This is not the place to examine Heidegger's questionable interpretation of Bergson's definition of time. But it should be noted that contemporaneously with Being and Time, studies by Nikolai Hartmann, Gabriel Marcel, and Alfred North Whitehead were published, which examine the problem of time from ontological, existential, and metaphysical viewpoints, respectively. Husserl's decisive phenomenological contribution to this question, in his Erfahrung and Urteil, was not published until 1948. Basing it on his work in transcendental logic, Husserl furnished the incisive formulation that, quote, space-thing constitution presupposes a time constitution. So Husserl really is the one who got it right. What did he just say? Every space-time constitution presupposes a time constitution. Space-time. Time is the backdrop that allows space to exist. It is the stage. Space is the actors. They work together. All right? That is what it is. Beautiful. This is in rough outline indeed, very rough outline, a sketch of the temporic endeavors in philosophy since the quote-unquote eruption of time was manifested during the French Revolution. This crucial process has been described in a philosophical historical recapitulation and summary by Werner Gent in his 3 books on time, which we have already mentioned. We will return in the next chapter to more sociologically oriented philosophies, notably to the Leninist interpretation of dialectical materialism and to English realism, whose extreme form is represented by North American pragmatism. By now it ought to be evident to what extent the incorporation of and pervasive encounter with the question of time has brought about a fundamental change in philosophy. All aspects of time previously hidden by the concept of time, the mental rational understanding of time, are now visible, and its multi-leveled nature has become clear. They're all visible. We have time as a quality, time as a quantity, time as an existential thing, time as a metaphysical thing, time as an ontology, time as procedural unfolding, time as mythic unfolding, time as magical unfolding. We have all these different stuff. It's all visible, and it's multi-layered, baby. At the same time, the recognition of time as an intensity and quality, as an independent value and an inherent element, has exploded the formal logical systems of previous philosophies. Yes, because instead of dogmatically imposing your purely spatial systems divorced of time, which is, say, divorced of time as a quality, you impose systems when you're not supposed to, because you're not doing it correctly. Think of a businessman who goes in and he has this spatial system that's going to increase profits by 4%. Instead of finding, he goes in seeking to impose his purely spatial system. He doesn't understand time as a quality. He doesn't understand that the workforce is demoralized because of an event that happened. He doesn't understand that the workforce is tense because of conflicts that happened. And his entire plan relies on cooperation and working. And that's not going to happen in this moment because there are problems. There are negative qualities charging the time spent at this office. So he goes in, he implements his terrible plan, he fails, he gets fired, his wife becomes a prostitute, his daughter turns to drugs, he kills himself, and then I start to date the daughter. She's above age, don't worry. Don't do that. Don't do that. Okay, time as a quality, right? Is it time to be utilitarian, or is it time to be deontological? Is it time to be virtue ethicist, or is it time to be utilitarian, or whatever? How do you know when to do it? Taking stock of the qualities that charge the present moment. How do you do that? By relying on your pre-rational and irrational faculties in addition to your rational faculties. Go watch my last video about rediscovering the power of intuition. It is a beautiful thing. Philosophy is mutating from the spatially bound representational and three-dimensional world into the four-dimensional perceptual world of aperspectival space-time freedom. This means that philosophy is superseding itself. As a consequence of conscious overdetermination by the acronon, the philosophemes, always tied to three-dimensional systems, are changing into four-dimensional etiologemes, that is, into pure utterance and impartation of truth via the increasing transparency of what is true. With these assertions, we are already in the complex of questions surrounding our second point. This we would like to consider not just from the stance of existential and vitalist philosophy, but also from that of philosophies with a psychological as well as a logistic and mathematical basis, whose impulses stem primarily from their encounter with the new physics. Although surprising with respect to logicism, these philosophies have in their own way ventured, or will have to venture, the leap out of their compulsion to purely rational systems and conceptualism. We, my friends, will pick up next week. Hope you guys enjoyed. Philosophers, please let me know where I went wrong. I assume I went wrong somewhere in this. I don't know. I'd prefer if you're cool about it, but again, you don't really have to be. And yeah, I'm excited. This is fun, isn't it? We are on page 406, by the way. So we're moving, boys. We're getting through it. We're getting through it. We are getting through it. And hopefully this was fun. Hopefully this was somewhat illuminating. Again, we're not done. We still have point 2 and point 3 to get there. So tomorrow, next week will be fun. We'll dig into quantum logic, transcendental logic, and some other things too. So love you guys. Let me know what you guys think, and I'll see you soon. Thank you guys.